Welcome to episode 90 of Retropower Uncut. You'll see I've got my finest clothes on and we're not in the workshop, and that's because we're about to hit the road to drive to Goodwood for the Retro Rides Weekender. So we've got the important stuff on board: beer, barbecues, lots of meat. It looks like a Celica Owners Club meet at the moment. We've got my Celica here, Jamie's awesome GT4, Scott's Fiesta, Focus. Not so sure that's so great. And then they're hiding the VRS, which I guess isn't going actually, because that's Jamie's second car. Someone's doing all right for themselves, aren't they? Right, let's hit the road and see what occurs. Well, I must interrupt to report on the functioning of my screen wash system, which is down on performance. While my reservoir is fully stocked with the requisite fluid, it appears that there might be some sort of detritus blocking the orifices through which it should pass. Therefore, what should be a steady stream upon engaging the motorised pump is more of a dribble, not supplying sufficient fluid to the windscreen and thus inhibiting my view of the road.
If you come close up to my rear end, I might be able to give you a little bit of second-hand spray if you would like.
Oh dear, it's 60 mile an hour, and the screen wash system does result in quite a lot of the water coming back into the car.
Well, I'm currently sat at about, well, depends what speedo you read. If you read what speedo in my car, I'm doing 90. I guarantee I'm not doing 90. I don't know where I am. I'm trying to catch that, really.
George, it sounds like you're on a paddle steamer or something.
Fuck, this car is too fucking loud!
Just a little MPG update for you all. I'm currently at 61.1. This is still climbing. Temperature set at around 19.5 degrees C. Just so to be clement. Seats are holding me up very nice, supported in all areas. And due to the overloading in the rear, the ride is still surprisingly good.
There's a drive shaft on the bridge over the M3. I mean, that's got to have been a bad crash.
Just say, Scott, from back here, I can see those mud flaps are doing a sterling job. It's a jolly good job you fitted them for a day like today. Well, I've got Tom back behind me, which is good, but I'm now stuck behind some nondescript fucking Toyota day van thing. Check out his guilt trip message on the back of his doors. Making life better for our children or some bullshit.
It's brightening up. I must say the racing Picasso is looking particularly good from behind. The exhaust is perfectly centralised within its aperture. The number plate has the correct spacing. The badging is original and correct, as is the paintwork. It is a fine example.
Oh, she is. The pride of France, as I like to call her.
I just want to clarify, this smell is not me, it is the fucking boxer in front of me. I just want to clarify that.
Don't worry, George, that's not how voice messages work. We can't tell.
there. It's
Got a long wheel.
Hold
Shooting.
still,
Hang
love
on.
on. This won't hurt a bit.
Right.
That's the only accent you got right.
Whoa. Actually, that has solved my my trouser issue.
It's not even touching his trousers.
Right, that's it.
Here we go. Here we go.
You wasted my duct tape. This has got to hold my coolant hoses on the way home.
Oh, is this silica?
There we go.
Silica
It's
approved.
potential silicon mending tape.
Genuine.
Comfortable?
Do you ever
is
wear
the worst I've ever
trousers?
looked.
Do you ever wear jeans that actually fit?
Done.
Right.
Still need a belt, I feel. I may still need a belt.
Why is yours broke then, Jamie? What's wrong with the belt around your waist?
Yeah, it's the metal bits.
I see your problem is
The
completely
problem
solved.
It's just there. You see it dangling about.
The needle.
No, the needle bits. The needle bits in it.
It's there. The metal bit is dangling in the middle.
That bit there. The other bit. That bit.
Yeah,
That
I see that. I see
middle.
that. It's too small there to poke through the hole.
Pop the end off. Yes, that.
I'm not fucking like.
You're not that pissed.
Far too
Come
long.
on,
I
idiot.
appreciate the issue, like, you know, like,
I'm not a fucking idiot. Look at
look at me, exactly.
I understand how a belt works.
Give me some respect.
What says the man in the duct tape braces?
Hello, we made it back to the workshop in one piece, just about. Although I must admit, between the amount of alcohol we consumed and the amount of time we wanted to look at cars and not film stuff, we weren't really able to do an episode there. So I'm hoping you enjoyed that awesome montage. It's a show we've been going to for a long while now, Retro Rides, either the Gathering or the Weekender. And it's just an awesome show because it's so laid back, and I think some people perhaps don't like it because it's not all about, it's not that every car there is executed to the highest standard. There's just a massive mix of cars, and the underlying thing is that everybody there is just a massive petrol head, and it's just a relaxing weekend, you know, to hang out with like-minded people. So great weekend. We were lucky with the weather, apart from rain on the way down, then it dried up, a treat, and was sun for the rest of the weekend. So we're back in the shop. I'm going to start with Landcruiser. James was waiting for those studs which we'd forgotten to send for plating, so they came back from plating. That allowed him to build up the half shafts on the back, which allowed him to then complete the rear axle build. We've got the brake package on there now, so that's, if you cast your minds back, we did a brake conversion which uses MR2 rear calipers. So they're a handbrake caliper for a really big diameter disc, which is quite unusual. So we've got those, and then we've got the, I think they're Pajero? No, not Pajero. No. What the fuck is that? No, what are them discs from on the back of this?
They're Prado.
Prado, that's the one I'm after, yes. 70 series Prado, yeah. The discs are 70 series Prado Landcruiser discs, which are a good diameter for those calipers and go directly onto the hubs. So really nice brake conversion and that came up with on the back. So yeah, we are now rolling. I think the only thing left on here that's not in its final form is the wheel nuts, which are going to be replaced with some Xylem coated ones. But yeah, looking good on that front. And then Adam has been working on the engine build. So he was just doing the crank fitment and starting the rod and piston fitment last week. We talked about the plastic gauging for the bearing clearances, and I'll elaborate a bit more on that because I noted from some of the comments that perhaps people thought that was the only thing we checked, but it's actually just a double check essentially. So Adam's already gone through, mic'd up all of the journals on the crank, checked that everything was within tolerance, and of course we then get a bearing set that is correct for that standard journal size. But it's nice to have a second check, and there's not really another way you can check other than by, you know, measuring the journals and the bearing thicknesses and assuming that everything goes together as per those measurements. It's just nice to have another check with it actually all done and installed and all the nuts torqued up. And that's what the plastic gauge allows you to do, is basically check the clearance between the bearing and the journal with everything in its final bolted up state. So he'll go through and do that on all of the journals. Everything fine, so that's all together for the final time, and then he's moved on to the heads. which there's being 32 valves to do in total, quite a lot of work involved in just refitting the valves and collets and springs. And we've got quite a cool tool which Nat built a few years back, just a bench mounted valve spring compressor. So we've got just a bench on the side there with a rubber mat on it to protect the face of the head, and then just a metal tube along it with just a basic kind of stanchion off it and a handle that we bolt on with an arm coming down onto the back of the valve. With a lot of leverage on it, so you can just hold the valve spring compressed to get the collets in without straining away on it for ages, but also you can do it really quickly. So it's just a really handy tool for that job. So yeah, he's smashed away, got all those 32 valves, stem seals, springs and collets in place. And then the next step on that is going to be the shims. So as with a lot of Toyota engines of that era, it's solid shims rather than, or solid followers I should say, rather than hydraulic followers, which are shimmed to get the valve clearances correct. So because we've had the valve seats recut, they won't be the original shims. So the next step is going to be going through, measuring the distance between the cam lobe and the valve stem in a certain cam position for each valve. From that we can calculate the thickness the shims need to be, and then we're going to order or have ground the shims to the correct sizes. And then we can move on, get all that together. That's really the sort of big time-consuming job left on the engine build. In theory, the rest of it should be more or less bolting things together. So that's good. I think we've got the transfer case parts back now, so Nat will be able to rebuild the transfer box, and all of that should fall into place. So hopefully when the engine's built, transfer box will be ready around the same time. We've already got the main transmission back. Get all of that lot mated up, then we can get it in, and then we'll be able to bolt the body on, which is just sitting over there. Adam's been doing some further work on that. This is the other Adam G. So he was looking at all the door builds. So he's gone through all the door components, and we've been formulating a plan in terms of whether we're disassembling and plating things or just cleaning them up. And actually the door latches, which is always an awkward one on restorations because they tend to be assembled in a way where they're not designed to come apart, with lots of swaged over pivots and pins in them. And you can't plate them as a complete assembly, otherwise you get loads of little rusty areas coming out on the joints where the line of sight of plating couldn't get to. Now as it is, they're very, very good in this car, so we're going to leave them as they are, just clean them up and re-grease them. Same with the sort of link bars and things that go to the handles. All they had on them was overspray from a previous paint job, so that will just be cleaned off with thinners, and actually the plated finish underneath is pretty good. So a lot of the door mech is just going to go back together. We've dynamatted inside the doors. Now I don't imagine the car's going to be hugely refined, and there's a lot of areas where you can't get sound deadening because it's a visible paint surface inside, so we can't obviously put any dynamat on there, but we have done it inside the doors, a little bit inside the screen surround where the wiper mechanism goes, just to try and damp down the wiper motor noise. So a few bits where we could. Then he started to do some of the seals, so he's been doing the seals for the body sides where they drop onto the main body tub. They're done, I believe, now, so one body side's on, the other one's ready to go on. We've received all the seals from Cool Cruisers, I think it was. I forget what state they're in, but somewhere in the US. They provided us with a complete rubber seal set for the whole car, which is actually a nice little cornerstone to allow us to crack on with a lot of the general build work on that. So yeah, looking forward to progressing with that and then getting it on here. The Morris, John's on with that at the minute. Earlier in the week, James finished the differential rebuild. So I think he was just sort of halfway through that last time, setting up the turning torque on the pinion. We were then getting the backlash set correctly, painting up the teeth, checking the contact patch. In terms of the bearing, the diff carrier bearing preload as well is another thing that needs setting, and there's a number in terms of the distance the case spreads apart with the load of the bearings, and that's actually what's used to determine the bearing preload. So it's a case of using a very big micrometer which goes around the two sides of the case to two given points and working how far the case spreads when you preload the bearing. So that's how that's done. But yeah, with that all set up, diff completely together. That was refitted in the rear subframe. That allowed us to get the shafts in. So that's the back end of the drivetrain done, and the only remaining thing is the prop. So now we've got the diff back in, we're just going to confirm the measurement for the prop, which is slightly different to MX-5 because we've very slightly shortened the backbone. We haven't physically shortened it, but where the backbone joins onto the gearbox, the MX-5 gearbox, we made the holes slightly further back so we could shorten it. Well, I think it was about 50 mil. So in theory, the prop will be an MX-5 prop, but about 50 mil shorter because it's an MX-5 gearbox and diff. But we're just confirming that dimension. And then we've got the exhaust in temporarily for the minute because we need to just design the brace for the rear subframe. There's a section on the MX-5, it's just a very basic tubular brace that braces up the two rear wishbone mounts. We're going to just design a slightly nicer brace for that, and it's got to clear the exhaust, so we've got the exhaust on for that reason. And then, quite excitingly, the wiring loom was finished. So Max over at Bramax and his crew of guys have been building the wiring looms. So that's the complete engine harness and the complete car harness, which is in two parts. So there's a section that sits behind the dash, connects up to the two PDMs. So it's a pair of ECU Master 16-channel PDMs, or PMUs as they call them, power management units. That then runs down, the rear leg runs down the sill, across the bulkhead, through the bulkhead, and then feeds out to the various components in the back. And actually John's just doing the wiring for the rear lights and rear fog and reverse lights at the minute, just because we wanted to get that done whilst the exhaust was in situ to see how we were going to run it from a heat point of view. The front leg is then plugged in a separate plug which branches off, runs through and down the inner wing on the sort of wheel side of the inner wing, and then across the front panel to feed both lights. And then the engine management harness is another self-contained harness which has a connector into the main loom for the bits that connect between the two. So things like the feed to tell the fan to turn on, the fuel pump to turn on, feed to the tacho, that kind of thing. Max has done a great job as usual. We've sort of gone for all of his looms are very high spec. We haven't gone completely bonkers. If you know, the absolute top end would be Raychem DS25, I think it is, heat shrink throughout, and auto sport connectors, which are incredibly expensive throughout, and everything fully sealed. Now we kind of, on most of these road cars, we go with a slightly lesser spec where anything that's external is built to that spec with fully sealed with Deutsch DT and DTM connectors, and then the stuff inside the car tends to be like a nylon braiding on the wire. It's still Type 44, Raychem Type 44 wire, which is incredibly high spec wire, just unnecessary for it to be fully sealed inside the car. And we tend to use quick make connectors largely inside the car, just to try and keep costs a little bit more sensible, although make no mistake, it's still a fairly expensive wiring loom on the whole. So yeah, we can start getting that in now, which is a bit of a cornerstone again, because when we've got the wiring in behind the dash, we can then get the heater box in, and that really allows all of the dash to go together. So that's where we're at with that. Mustang, speaking of, there's a lot of cornerstones going on this week. Mustang, we've been waiting for quite a while for the Dakota digital instrument panel, which has just come this morning. So we were just looking at that. That looks spot on, as all of the stuff we've had from them in the past is. So that can go in now, and then we can start doing all of the wiring now, laying out all of the sensor wiring that comes with that, bunching that in with the loom that's already roughly laid out in the car. We can then start actually looming stuff up for the final time. And that'll obviously visually finish the dash as well, because that's the only remaining big component that's missing on the dash. And then there are a couple of other small things on the same order, which they had in stock, but that we were waiting until they had everything before they shipped the order, which was one of the bumper braces for the front, and one section of the handbrake cable, which they were out of stock a long while ago when we ordered them a big order of parts from Summit Racing for it, but they've come in stock more recently, so they were on this order. So that means, yeah, we can get the handbrake finished, we can get the front bumper on, which it's been lacking for a long while now, and we can get the instruments in, and then we can start doing the wiring. So that's all on track. Utah, I've been out in that again, just battling little niggles. It's a part of the build which it's quite difficult to convey to people, because if it were my own car, this would have probably been done, in inverted commas, 6 months ago, because when it's your own car, you tend to forgive lots of little tiny niggles, or, you know, just functionality things or little noises, rattles. And the one I've been battling this week was brake squeal on the rear brakes. So when you were just coming to a sort of halt or at slow speed, probably 5 to 10 mile an hour, with very light brake pressure on. The rear brakes were kind of howling, resonating, because essentially after a lot of messing around, we discovered it was that the pads were kind of grabbing, a typical pad noise essentially. They were grabbing and letting go and grabbing and letting go, but very, very rapidly to make a sort of high frequency whine. So we went through quite a few things. There was a lot of checking the alignment of the calipers, which is all good. Then I was worried that maybe the thickness of the caliper brackets we got on there was somehow setting up a harmonic resonance. So we did a thicker set of brackets, which changed the tone slightly, but the problem was still there. And in the end, what I've done is actually do some offset shims. So you see this quite a lot on road cars, that you get a little stainless steel shim with the brake pads that's kind of cut in half, which means that the caliper applies more pressure on one end of the pad. And that basically solved the problem. Applying slightly more pressure at the leading end of the pad just removed that resonance, because it basically pulls it, rather than the one end coming in, sorry, it's the trailing end of that, rather than the leading end coming in and grabbing and snatching the pad flat onto the disc and then letting go and snatching again, and that process repeating over and over again causes the noise. It applies the pressure on the other end first, so it kind of squeezes that end so it only touches the half of the pad, and then it's only when you put a lot of pressure on that the full pad contact comes in. And by the time you've got a lot of pressure on, the problem isn't there anyway, which it wasn't already. So we've cracked that one. I've had the car over the pit, just been going back through. Now I think I've done about 150 miles in it now, so we've been going back through, checking all the paint marks, spanner checking everything again, retightening anything, making sure we're happy with all of that. I've done a few other things as well, sort of finishing touches. So the badges, we had a big badge machine for the back, which Jim was doing the hand painted inlay of the black into, which looks just come out really nice, that has. And then to me, that's always been the finishing touch on the back, and I've known for a long while that the car looked almost too plain on the rear. But I've been convinced that the badge edition is going to be what ties it all together and just balances it out, and I'm absolutely chuffed that it has. We did smaller versions of those badges for the front wheels as well, again machined, polished up and inlaid with black paint by hand, and they've been attached onto the front centre caps. So yeah, we're just going through finishing touches now really. I'm going to put the back seat in. I've got to do a little tweak on the boot alignment, so I was going through earlier in the week checking all the seal contact areas. Somebody will probably have some top tip better than me on this one, but I go around just with the grease, and I literally put a thumb of grease around the seal, carefully close whichever door or boot lid, whatever it is, and then release it again, and you can see a sort of trace of where it's touched by the grease being transferred to the panel, and then you can clean it off again afterwards. So the boot lid I've just got to adjust slightly because there's a little section on the corner that's not contacting. But yeah, we're into absolute last details on that now. So yeah, excited to hopefully see that handed over. And I think on that note, Stratos is back in here. Don't forget the Stratos. So the guys were wet sanding and flattening the paint on this last week, which looks absolutely stunning now. The rear clamshell is still with them, so that's been completely re-prepped. Because subsequently to the original paint, it was decided to delete the rear spoiler. We had to fill the holes for that, and then we've taken advantage of needing to repaint that, also to tweak the rear flank vent holes to make them fit in a slightly different way. So we've cut the apertures all the way through. We had a slightly stepped in recess before, but it was going to be very hard to make that look neat. So what we've decided to do was cut the aperture out completely, so it's just a hole with no other detail, and then we're going to make a piece that bonds onto the back face, and then the vents themselves will be an aluminium machine part which then bolts to that flange that we've bonded on the back, but sits up into the hole to be flush with the outer bodywork. So again, the 3D scanners come massively in handy there. So we cut the holes through, and then we've 3D scanned the back of the clamshell on the inside of that to make the sort of mounting flanges that will be bonded onto the body, and then from that scan we'll be able to then design the vents themselves. So that's ready for paint now. In fact, Gaz is probably painting that rear clam today. We also re-prepped the rear luggage compartment cover, because where the hinges were bonded on, we'd noticed, I guess from the pressure of the hinges when it's shut, pushing against the seal, it had just pulled the fiberglass slightly, and you can see a little ripple over each hinge. So we've re-prepped that now. It's had time to settle over time. and that's going to be repainted at the same time. And then hopefully in the next week or so we're going to get the mould tool through from being machined for the rear louvre / window aperture mount for the rear clam. And we're going to just carry on with the general build on this and push it through to the final hurdle. So that's that. I'm going to hand over to Nat and show you what's going on in the metal workshop. I feel like this is going to be a very long episode, so hopefully you see it through to the end, and we'll see you again next week. Right, well, thank you very much, Cal, for the little handover there, and we start in the dark side this week in the body prep area with bits of Stratos. So we've finished making the fiberglass modifications for the rear gill vents, as I'm going to term them this week, because I probably called them something totally different last week. We finished the fiberglass modifications for that. It's now been primered, and the primer is now being blocked back. So we're getting gradually towards the point of being able to paint this, following the tweaks that needed doing. So I imagine next week this will probably be, we should be painted on this next week. That's only a fairly minor task in the scheme of things that are going on in here, but one that nonetheless needed doing to get the Stratos progressing a bit more. So that's cracking on there. And then moving along here, there's been a few stages of progress on the Camaro this week. Starting at the beginning of the week with the polyester another coat of polyester being put on. A very light coat on most of the car, but a slightly heavier coat in the areas where we've completely gone through all the original build. So the front edge of the front part of the doors and the back part of the wings initially. The wing to door nightmare area, we've put a reasonable amount of build on there again to give us the ability to blend all that area in without any waves where the polyester meets the bare metal. So more polyester on there, more polyester over the whole car. Most of that's now been blocked back off. This is now on the cusp of going to primer, and so at that stage we also need to get it ready for the Raptor coating to go on, which will be on the underside and on the inside. And to do that it needs to go onto rotisserie, so there's a bit of a knock-on effect, so it's got to be de-panelled to do all of that. So it's been now de-panelled. An extra little, I'll point it out as we go by in a minute, but there was an extra little bit of fabrication work that we'd forgotten about, if I'm totally honest, which is that the little tube frame that we now have on the front clip tube frame that carries the inner wings and carries the front end panels, we'd neglected to put a support in for the upper edge of the front valance. And originally that was held by the bonnet latch support panel, which we no longer have because the bonnet's now on pins. So the middle of that valance could move in and out slightly. So to preserve the alignment properly there, we've added an extra tube onto the front of the subframe. We've just bent a piece of 1-inch tube. I was trying to think what size it was then. Bit of 1-inch seamless tube, bent a section, and that's tack welded up now onto the frame. That frame has got to have some finish welding work done on it. Now it's back off, but that's now tack welded up onto the frame with a little bracket to carry the centre of the upper part of the front valance to stop that moving as the air pressure comes on and off it, because it was a little bit bendy, the middle of that. So anyway, that's an aside. That's now done as well. So this has now been de-panelled. This will be going onto the rotisserie and be prepared, the final prep for Raptor on the underside and epoxy primer on the outside. So yeah, finally we're getting through the huge quantity of sanding and getting a little bit nearer the final paint now. We're not too far away, but epoxy primer and Raptor being the next stages on that. So moving out of here, let Jamie do a little reverse. That little tube I just mentioned is there, as I say, tacked up, pretty thoroughly tacked up, but that's on there, and that's just, we've done so that we've got some spacer adjustment there to the front valance, but that now carries, the front valance sort of comes down here and bolts along this, comes round here and bolts with a little spacer onto that, and that just stops the bit just where the grill sits about here, and the top part of the front valance could just move slightly, so that now carries that and prevents that moving. So that's what that was all about. So that's now done. I'm going to pause here now for a moment because I'm right next to it. We have had a delivery this week from Mack Industries. I'll just pause for a minute because Richard's just going to move a forklift and it's quite noisy. So we'll just move that. There we go. I've paused.
We've had a delivery from Mac Industries, a nice new fabrication table. 2 metre by 1 metre, 8 millimetres thick top with 16 millimetre locating holes. Extremely sturdy table. I think they would call it one of their Pro 8 tables with legs and nice sturdy casters and little rubber pads that wind down so you can sit it firmly on the floor. Very nice bit of equipment. We needed another bench in here anyway because we're always jostling for bench space now with three people fabricating in here most of the time. So we needed some extra fabrication space regardless of what type of table it was. And we also have a recurring need for fixture tables. Previously, I've always made little fixture plates that we can then just clamp down to our big cast fabrication bench over there. The downside is there's nowhere really anywhere other than at the edges of that bench to clamp anything. So with this table, we can clamp everywhere. You have these type of clamps that release, that socket into the top of the table. The clamps are available from a number of sources. These were actually not from Mac, actually. These were from Matt at Stakes's Metalwork Machinery. I'm conscious not to push Matt out of the picture here. These actually came from there. The table is from Mac Industries. Very, very nice bit of kit. Nicely laser etched with these alignment lines on top, which just give you a bit more, just make things a little bit easier for squaring and aligning while you're setting them out. It is a very nice finish, very, very neat, very good job. Really happy with that. So hopefully between that, our little bench there, our main fabrication bench there, and a couple of mobile toolboxes and whatever, we should have enough workspace. We don't have like a one formula fits all for what people do in here, so you kind of need a reasonably flexible arrangement in terms of workbenches, and this adds another bit of flexibility to it. It's one of the other things that we all wanted this bench for, is that we've got a few different people have different terms for this, but hammer forming or jig chasing. We have a couple of hammer form stroke jig chasing jobs on the horizon, and we have no real ability we have no bench where it's possible to do that properly. You need a lot of clamps for doing that sort of work, and you need to be able to fix those clamps sort of pretty flexibly around on a bench, and the top of this bench will be very useful for that in terms of we'll be able to fit a lot of clamps around it. If you've got a part this big here, we can put a lot of clamps around it to keep pushing the material down as we hammer form it. So that's another reason for also having this bench. Another reason why I wanted an 8mm thick, obviously Mac also do a 10mm thick top. I figured 8mm was a reasonable combination of not weighing too much, but being strong enough to do hammer forming on without distorting the top of the table. There's quite a lot of support under this table. There's quite a network of laser cut support gussets underneath here that prevent it all distorting. So it's pretty strong. I think it'll do the job. So yeah, we're quite happy with that. I'm going to do a little aside then, gesticulate in the direction of the Escort. Nothing's actually changed on the Escort body shell this week. I'm going to point in that direction because it's that project, but all of the work that's been going on the Escort this week has actually been in the room that I started in last week, which is the machine room at the back, the little machine shop we have. Where I can hear the music of the lathe gearbox currently, the Colchester music going on right now. But I have been finishing off turning the parts for the rear suspension on that this week, amidst other jobs. That's now all done. All of the turned parts for the rear suspension on that are now finished. The remaining parts that need making are bent tube and cut tube and fish mouse tube sections. So it's just the tube parts left to do on that, and then fabricating, hence back to the table again, in that I'm going to be using this table to fabricate the subframe parts for the pair of Escorts. Obviously the other Escort's behind camera at the minute. So that's what's been going on in the Escort, lots of machining. But that marathon's come to an end now. I've finished tapping the last, one of the last wishbone rose joint tubes for the wishbones. I finished tapping those this morning, so that's all now ticked off and done. So more Escort progress next week in terms of suspension work. Trying to think on the next, I guess the next thing, gesticulating in that general direction, would be in front of the Escort. We have a Jensen doorskin. Tom's actually off today. Tom's got a day off today, but we've got a aluminium Jensen doorskin. Tom's been busy, as usual, obviously, making Jensen doorskins. This is the second one. He'd done the majority of one last week and finished that at the beginning of this week. And then he's carried on and done the second one this week, which he's now got to the stage where he's welded this top section in. There's a weld line running along here, which you can just about make out under the, he's put some black paint on it just to help him see what he's doing while he's filing it. You can see the weld line along there. So this section's made separately and then welded on, and then he's metal finishing that area, which is why the paint's on there, so he can file it and tap it and see what he's doing. That's getting there then he's got to do clinch the sides. Actually no, I tell a lie, he has clinched the side. I'm wrong, that side is clinched, the back's clinched. So the folds are on the ends. They've obviously got to be returned completely once they go onto the door frames, but he's getting both the door skins to the stage where they can be put onto the frames and put in the holes on the car. Then we can fettle the car as well, because some of the fiberglass needs some adjustment around these, and then these can be mated to the actual door inners, and we'll pretty much be there with having a set of doors. So yeah, next week hopefully should have these. Hopefully, with a bit of luck and following wind, there's quite a lot of toing and froing on the job, but with a bit of luck and following wind, these should be attached to the door inners next week. So yeah, it's coming along nicely. Tom's doing a beautiful job of some aluminium shaping. And then moving on to the Churchill Mark II Jaguar Coupe. Whoa! Clang! Someone's dropped a clanger. I'm going to wander around here and make Jarkel's life difficult. We come to the back of the Churchill Jag. Stu's been ploughing on with this, and he's now got quite a lot of the panel work done. He's finished the chassis rails off, did a couple of little adjustments to those at the beginning of the week, a couple of little tweaks, and finished getting those welded in place, finished making the gusset sections to tie the front of the rails into the rear bulkhead and into the rear of the original rails and into the inner arches, which is all done now. That's all finished and tidied up. Then Stu's finish welded the cross member that goes across above the back of the subframe, then manufactured this panel which goes in between the two rails, obviously stating the bleeding obvious there. That goes in between the rear rails and joins to the boot floor, and then it's got this nice folded section at the bottom. The boot floor is then going to sit on top of that and lap in up here, and that then creates a cross member within the folded section that goes across, and then he's put the threaded inserts into that cross member so that we've got some mounting points for exhaust system underneath. You'll notice this little cutout here. That little cutout there is to clear the spare wheel well, which is currently undergoing manufacture, and you saw earlier just over on the fabrication table, Stu's making up the spare wheel well at the moment. This car's going to have a space saver spare wheel. We're just awaiting that from Simply Performance at the moment. We've actually been had a couple of dealings with Simply Performance this week, so I'll get onto those a bit more in a minute. But we're just awaiting an aluminium XJS space saver spare wheel to finalise the exact dimensions of the spare wheel well. But that'll be going in there, and that's what that clearance in the back of that cross member's for there. So that's Stu's been busy getting that lot together, and he's currently making, just out of camera shot there, but you probably saw it a minute ago on the fabrication table again, Stu's currently tweaking away making the battery box, which is for a pretty substantial battery, as you can see. That's going to be dropping in also into the boot floor area, so that we've got a nice battery, you know, plenty of starting capacity, no issues with dead batteries in the middle of nowhere, because the car's kind of, you know, designed to be a bit of a GT car. It's not just a sort of short run thing. It wants to be for distances, and you know, plenty of electrical demand. Make sure we've got plenty of battery capacity. A little bit of weight's not really a major concern. So make sure we've got plenty of battery capacity and a big battery box. So that's what's going on there. I'm trying to think. I was going to go off on a tangent to do with this. Yes, I mentioned Simply Performance a short while ago. The tail end of last week, I believe, or the very beginning of this week, I lose track now, we've decided to go a slightly different route with the front suspension on this car for a couple of reasons, which are still undergoing evolution and development at the moment. But the noise of the pressure washer outside that you can hear is Rich washing, jet washing an XJS front clip, which has been supplied by Simply Performance, for which we plan to use in this car in a narrowed form. I need to do that, we need to narrow the steering rack as well. And this car is left-hand drive, so Simply Performance have supplied an XJS front clip and a left-hand drive XJS steering rack. The clip is symmetrical, there's no difference with that. That can be left or right-hand drive, but the rack is a left-hand drive rack. So one of my jobs on my agenda is to strip that rack down and determine the best way of narrowing it. I'm pretty confident it can be done. The only quandary is exactly how we deal with the piston position. But we'll have some footage on that next week once I've actually taken it apart and had a look at it, and we'll be able to, hopefully I'll be able to go through how to or not to narrow an XJ Jaguar Series XJ Jaguar or XJS power steering rack, because that's the plan to use in this car is the narrowed later Jaguar setup, later XJS setup with a narrowed power steering rack. That's the theory anyway at the moment. We'll see how that evolves. There may be complications along the way, but there have been a couple of reasons in the background for wanting to go that route. So that's why we've been dealing with Simply Performance, as I say. Also, the spare wheel coming for this from them. Very helpful outfit to deal with. Actually, we've had quite a few. We've bought quite a few parts over the years from them. Very helpful company to deal with. Hold a lot of Jaguar parts stock, and yeah, very highly recommended. So I think that pretty much rounds up where we are on the Churchill Jaguar. I've probably forgotten a few things, I imagine, but I think that pretty much rounds up where we're at. Hopefully next week, I think we should be looking at having a boot floor in. There's no reason why not. We should be looking at a completed boot floor, and hopefully I'll have made a bit of progress then in investigations on the front suspension and exactly how we're going to go about modifying that, and exactly how we're going to go about modifying a steering rack. Hopefully my loose plan in my head will work, and I'll be able to show you what that plan amounts to in terms of actual parts. So I think that covers everything for this week, and we'll see you again in a week's time.